Joining us from Sydney, Australia, today's guest is Dr. Mahreen Khan. Mahreen is a psychologist and senior quantitative researcher of people insights at Atlassian. She received her Master of Organizational Psychology at the University of New South Wales in 2015, where she won the Stephanie J. Moylan Memorial Prize for Best Performance in an Organizational Master's Thesis. And she went on to complete her PhD at the university in 2020. If you look on Google Scholar, you will find 7 academic titles under Mahreen's name. She's conducted quite a bit of fascinating research over the years. The paper, though, that we'd like to focus on today was published in spring of 2021, and it is titled, quote, "College Students in the Western World Are Becoming Less Emotionally Intelligent, a cross-temporal meta-analysis of trait emotional intelligence." Before we dive in here, Mahreen, I just want to say thank you for coming on the show and sharing space with us. Arjun and I are very happy to have you.
Absolutely, no worries. Really excited to talk with you both.
Wonderful. Well, before we discuss your work, Mahreen, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what drew you to academic research. From what I've heard from friends in the space, research tends to be pretty demanding work, certainly requires a lot of dedication. What attracted you to research and what have you enjoyed about it?
Sure, sounds good. Well, I've always loved psychology. When I was a kid, I loved reading books and trying to, figure out people. And I was always doing those online personality tests. So when it was time to get to university, I knew I really wanted to study psychology. At the time, I thought I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, but I'm the sort of person that's very empathetic. So I quickly figured out that if I were to become a clinical psychologist, I might, start taking the weight of the world on my shoulders. But when I did my honors project, which was in the field of clinical psychology, I was looking at feelings of guilt and immorality in people who had obsessive compulsive contamination concerns. I realized I loved research, absolutely loved it. I just really loved learning a lot, especially about psychology, which is something I was always really interested in, really loved coming up with my own ideas, my own investigations, conducting an experiment, analyzing the data, trying to fit it in with the existing research. So I knew that I loved research. I kind of moved away from clinical psychology into organizational psychology for my master's, just because I thought practically there's a lot more areas of application as compared to clinical psychology. But when I did that and I did my placements, I still realized I'm doing my master's thesis, I absolutely love research. So that's when I started doing the PhD, and I wanted to do it in the area of the development of emotional intelligence. Again, absolutely loved it. I always thought I would go into academia, but I got an offer from Atlassian soon after completing my PhD, and I really love the company culture, and it's still in the area of research, just a little bit more applied research. So I think it's something that I've always been interested in, especially psychology, and I really like the ability to learn more and investigate more and test my hypotheses. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what drew me into research.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm curious, when you have thought about coming up with a specific subject for any of your research, are you kind of pulling from the headlines or just thinking about what interests you personally? I guess, how do you go from an idea to really centering the core of the hypothesis and creating research around it?
I think for the most part, I really think about an area that I'm particularly interested in. So when, doing my PhD, I was really interested in emotional intelligence. And I remember when I started, I spent a good few months just reading everything I could about emotional intelligence and really trying to figure out what the gaps were in the research, and then trying to focus my research questions on whatever the gaps were in the field. But basically, I pick an area that I'm really interested in and then try and see, okay, what's been studied, what's not been studied? Is there an area where I can make a contribution?
Yeah, that makes sense. That is a really cool thing about academia, that you're building on what came before and you're leaving a legacy for future researchers to work off of. It definitely feels like you're part of a continuum in history. I think that's really cool. Well, maybe I can tell you where I actually first came across your paper on emotional intelligence. I was scrolling Instagram, and none other than Joe Rogan had posted about it. Hundreds of thousands of people had engaged the post. I think the decline of emotional intelligence in the younger generations is a topic that is really front of mind for a lot of people right now. I think there's been this kind of arc of confluent events over the last 30 years that have really reshaped social interaction for young people. Many of these dynamics, we've talked about at length previously on the show. But we've seen the rise of video game culture, particularly among boys, starting in the 90s with the advent of PlayStation and N64. In that same area, parents began consuming excessive news coverage of violent crime, and many stopped letting their kids roam free in their own neighborhoods for fear of getting kidnapped, particularly here in the US. Obviously, the iPhone changed everything when it came out in 2007. Young people now have a digital world in the palm of their hand that can entertain them, comfort them, keep them company. 84% of kids in the US now have their own smartphones, and over half of kids own a smartphone by the age of 11. And of course, over the last 2 years, we've had a protracted period of lockdowns that have accelerated and I think exaggerated a lot of these dynamics. No doubt the lockdowns have interrupted social interaction for everyone, but I think most unfortunately for young people who are now spending a record amount of time on screens, upwards of 7 to 8 hours a day. Many of them are missing out on formational social experiences and really starting to live up to the name, the indoor generation. So that was kind of my layman's rant, but maybe you can give us an overview of the parameters of your research, Mahreen, and a kind of overview of the findings, and then we can drill down piece by piece to get a deeper understanding of the subject matter.
Sounds good. Well, I think the inspiration for the idea came from my initial studies on emotional intelligence, which was looking at the development of emotional intelligence over time. And when doing that research, I came across a lot of research on cross-temporal meta-analysis, so looking at generational changes in personality traits. And there's a lot of research out there. There's research showing that over time, narcissism is increasing, perfectionism is increasing. Lots of other things. Anxiety and depression is rising. So I was really curious how emotional intelligence fits into this space. And, as with many other psychological concepts, there are some varying competing definitions of emotional intelligence. But in this particular paper, the way in which we conceptualized emotional intelligence was similar to that of a personality trait, and it's comprised of 4 overarching facets. So you have the facet which is about well-being, which is, how much of a sense of well-being do you have in your life? We've got the facet self-control, which is, your ability to control your impulses, control your temptations, not give in to your urges. We have the facet emotionality, which is your ability to relate to one another and empathize with other people and be able to detect other people's feelings. And then we have sociability, so your ability to have social skills in your interactions with others. So I wanted to see, what are the changes in these 4 facets of emotional intelligence over time. So we conducted this cross-temporal meta-analysis, which is basically, an analysis of multiple independent scientific studies from the period of about 2003, which is when the first studies emerged on trait emotional intelligence, all the way up until 2018. So not quite 2 decades, but almost 2 decades. And what we observed was that the facets well-being, as self-control, and emotionality actually declined significantly over that time period. But what was particularly interesting was that we also looked at the factor of technology usage and used that in our analyses. So we looked at over every year, what was the percentage of individuals within that country that had used the internet or technology. So we looked at the countries Australia, the UK, the US, and Canada. And what we found was those increases in technology usage actually predicted the declines in emotional intelligence over time. So we found that really interesting. And that was really in line with a lot of other research on social media and technology usage. There's research showing that when you replace in-person communication with electronic communication, such as over social media or something along those lines, it can exacerbate feelings of loneliness because there's something very unique about in-person communication that actually allows you to really bond with somebody else. So that's part of why we hypothesized there were these decreases in emotional intelligence. And like I said, this coincides with other research showing that there are increases in depression, there's increases in anxiety disorders, potentially decreases in self-esteem. So we really, there does need to be further research in this space, but we do, given that we found that these decreases in emotional intelligence were predicted by increases in technology usage, we really do think that there is that link there.
Certainly. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Sorry, Arjun, did you have something?
Oh yeah, no, I have a bunch of things
Yeah, go for it.
based off of that. No, so your study went back to 2003. By the way, fascinating study, great work, obviously great contributions, and the ability to connect the dots and actually see some data around this is just proof points for people. So while people might feel this, there's now some data to support it. Question, so you're looking from 2003 through I guess 2020. How many people did you end up studying, and were you able to capture the whole or as much of the cohort of the human population as possible? In other words, like, were there any groups that were left out of the study? And if so, are there any plans to redo the study and account for some of the things that could have been missing from this first go at it?
So we looked at just college students. So the reason why we just looked at college students is that we wanted people of a comparable age, because if we were looking at people with different ages, there might be that confound in the effects of the decline in emotional intelligence over time. And across the potentially almost 2 decades, there was about 17,000 college students within the meta-analysis. So not quite all the college students, but enough that we can detect significant effects. I would have personally loved to do further research in this space, but given that I'm now not in academia, it might be a little bit more difficult, but I would encourage the other researchers in the emotional intelligence space to really pick this up and really pinpoint why exactly are these declines occurring, and is there anything that we can do to mitigate these declines?
Yeah, certainly. And on that topic of demographics that Arjun brought up, I think I came across in one of the summaries that some of these declines were more pronounced among young men than young women. Is that true, Maureen?
Yeah, so what we did is we looked at the gender composition of the samples that we had available in the meta-analysis, and what we found were the declines were stronger in those samples where there were more males as compared to females.
Interesting.
And not quite sure why this is the case. I mean, there is previous research showing that on aspects of emotional intelligence, females tend to score more highly, and that could be, multiple things. But maybe it is this, given that we're hypothesizing that it's due to technology, maybe the lack of in-person communication is affecting males more. Again, not sure why this is the case, but maybe something to do with the way in which females and males relate to one another and the extent to which in-person communication allows for that bonding in males as compared to females.
Right.
And in preparation for this conversation, I came across that there were multiple types of EI. You actually alluded to one of them, trait EI. If I understand that correctly, trait EI is around personality. But what is the other type of EI? And my question really is, like, is there a way to predict performance or education based off of the type of EI?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really great question. So the type of EI that we looked at was trait EI, which, like you said, we conceptualized as personality. But there's another form of EI that's referred to as ability EI, which is actually emotional intelligence as a skill. So, for example, the actual ability to manage your emotions, or the actual ability to perceive the emotions that somebody else is experiencing, or the ability to understand emotions. So the way in which this is measured is very similar to a cognitive ability test. So you might get faces and you have to pick the emotion that the person is experiencing, or you might get scenarios about an emotion that someone is experiencing and how would that person ideally manage that emotion. The reason why we didn't look at ability EI and declines in ability EI is because that's actually already been done. And what the researchers found was over time, the actual ability to have emotional intelligence, there were no changes over time. So this is really interesting. So whilst the skill to be able to perceive emotions, to understand emotions, to manage emotions, whilst that hasn't changed over time, when we think of emotional intelligence as more like personality and things like, you know, your feelings of well-being and your feelings of relating to one another and your feelings of self-control, that's declining. So I really think that those combination of studies is really interesting.
Oh, interesting. Somewhat sad, because if I hear you correctly, that means that as we are all getting older and living through different life experiences, our ability EI is not getting better, which tells me that we're not really putting ourselves in other people's shoes and really not in feeling with them to be able to even understand their emotions or ourselves. So when you say that, I'm a little bit shocked. I'm like, wait, I thought part of being human and like growing and getting through experiences is that you get to then learn and be able to be better, like become a better version of yourself and actually showcase more EI with people. I think we need to turn that around.
Actually, not quite. So you're
Oh,
talking
see?
about emotional intelligence over your own lifespan as you get older, which is a bit different from what that ability EI study actually did, which was look at ability EI over generations. So generationally,
Oh,
our emotional intelligence is not necessarily getting better, it's not necessarily getting worse, but when we look at emotional intelligence as personality, it is getting worse.
Yeah.
thank you for the clarity.
No
Sorry, go ahead,
worries.
Maureen. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, all good. I was just going to say, like, there are actually aspects of getting older which do get better with age. So, you know, there is still that benefit of getting older.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, we talked about traits in the context of narcissism. Actually, last year we had Dr. Keith Campbell on. He was the author of New Science of Narcissism. He was, we talked about, I think, trait neuroticism, trait disagreeability, and trait extroversion, because those are kind of the three traits involved in neurotic narcissism on one side and then grandiose narcissism on the other. So I think the traits are really interesting because they can evolve and change over time. It sounds like one generation can be scoring higher on trait narcissism than the previous generation, but when you look at the actual individual, if I have this right, your personality traits are pretty inelastic over time. Is that right, Maureen? Like if I'm a 60th percentile trait neuroticism in 2022, 10 years from now, I might rank pretty closely to that figure.
Yeah, so personality traits compared to a lot of other things tend to be quite stable. I mean, it can change, and there is some evidence that with certain life experiences like having kids or getting married or entering the workforce, that it can change your personality. But over shorter time periods, it tends not to change. And it's more likely to change over longer time periods, like a decade. But even then, it's less likely that it will change by a lot and more likely it will change by just a little bit. But it can change.
Got it. Well, that's encouraging. If you have a personality trait that's, I guess, causing dysfunction in your life, perhaps. So I find it really interesting that fourth element of trait, emotional intelligence, sociability, hasn't declined. It seems so. People are still, if I have it right, people are still able to interact with each other and exert influence as they may have in previous eras. But it sounds like the kind of internal aspects of emotional intelligence, like how people feel about themselves, their sense of relatedness to other people, their sense of internal connection with the world, those dimensions are suffering more. Is that a way of thinking about it, Maureen?
Yeah, actually, I thought that was really interesting as well. I mean, I didn't know what to expect with sociability, to be honest. I mean, if I remember correctly, it was actually close to being significant, but not quite. But definitely the other declines were a lot more pronounced, like well-being and self-control and emotionality. But this does make sense to me in the sense that if we're hypothesizing that there is all this impacts of technology, and what's happening with technology is that we're interacting with other people less, and we're becoming more lonely, and we're also comparing ourselves to other people. It makes sense that your well-being would decline. It also makes sense that potentially, because you have less in-person interaction, your ability to maybe empathize, so emotionality, might also be on the decline. And then with self-control, again, these things are like muscles. The more you practice it, the more they get better. But if you're having less in-person interaction, it makes sense that they would be less good than they otherwise would have been if there were those in-person interactions occurring.
Right.
Can you tie some of the decrease in EI to maybe the rise in obesity? Like, how is health linked into all of this?
It was actually one of the speculations that we had in the paper. So we were like, okay, we can speculate that emotional intelligence is, declining because of social media and because of technology. But there are other factors that are changing in society with time that might actually also help explain the decreases in emotional intelligence. So we did look at other things that we considered. So we considered that in that time period, there was also increasing obesity, which we know is not good for well-being. And then if your well-being is suffering, it makes sense that in turn, other aspects of emotional intelligence would suffer. There's that aspect of society that is changing, but there is also other things, like with younger people, there's increasing pressures on them, increasing academic pressure. We're very competitive in society these days, maybe a lot more so than in the past. And again, it might be because it's so easy now to compare yourself with other people, again, through social media. So maybe those pressures that younger people are facing, maybe that's also what's contributing to the declines in emotional intelligence. Again, this is why further research needs to be done, but it's entirely possible that the rise in obesity may be at least partially explains why there are these declines in EI.
Yeah. I mean, when you're overweight or obese, you probably don't feel that great about yourself. You have a lower self-esteem, which could lead to even more issues. Like, you could become even more depressed. And also maybe there's an element of, maybe we can teach the younger generation earlier around how they can view themselves, and how they can have like a strong positive body image of themselves very early on, in like in a way that's not like egotistical, but in a way that helps them avoid some of these eating disorders or anxiety or depression later in life.
For sure. I think that would be so important for kids, because so much research on how detrimental poor body image is on mental health and well-being. So completely on the same page with you there.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the self-control piece. Obesity is, I think, somewhat tied to lack of self-control, and really all of these three elements that have been in decline: well-being, self-control, and emotionality. I feel like we're sort of seeing manifest at a societal level. Well-being as evidenced by increase in suicide rates, self-control as evidenced by increase in obesity rates and increase in alcoholism during the pandemic, and then emotionality, like that lack of ability to tap into empathy. I think just the kind of animosity we've seen in the political landscape, the finger pointing, we've seen, at least in the US, between, across either side of the aisle. I think the research that you've conducted here really maps over sort of the macro trends we're seeing at a population level, which is really interesting.
It is really interesting. And I think it is quite a bad sign if these aspects of EI are declining. I remember you had actually asked, does trait EI actually predict anything? And this really ties into what you were saying right now. It predicts a lot of things. So trait EI really predicts your ability to do well in school, to do well in work, to be happy, to be mentally healthy, to be physically healthy, to have good relationship quality with other people. So if that's on a decline, then it might follow that all those other things could be on the decline as well. So if we need EI for good relationship quality, then it's not good if our relationships are on the decline as well. Because I think part of having empathy is that even when you disagree with somebody else, you can do it in a manner that's really constructive. So again, like you said about the macro trends, we can see, what's happening with the decreases in EI to what's happening at a more macro level.
Absolutely.
I would like to connect the dots to all of this, to something you had alluded to very early on in the conversation around, you mentioned that you felt like a very empathetic person early on. You mentioned that when you got in, started doing your PhD, it was on emotional intelligence. My question is, were you around family that taught you these things around like how to put yourself in another person's shoes? Like, did you have guidance? What kind of life experiences happened to you where you realized that, the perspective also includes other people, you can be sociable? How did you develop your own empathy at such a young age? I'm really curious about that.
Um, that's a really interesting question. Not quite. I think my family actually had a very stoic approach to emotions, where it's all like it was a family culture of just keeping it to yourself.
Yeah.
But I was I think from a very young age, not like that at all. Like I remember one of my very early life memories was I was watching TV and there was a girl on screen and her ice cream had fallen over. And I remember feeling so devastated for this poor girl that she had dropped her ice cream. But I think that sense of really feeling emotions for other people, it led me to really want to read a lot. Like I was that bookworm back when I was a kid, always reading, and I felt so invested in the characters. But I think through reading so much and so deeply and so widely, I really became exposed to other ways of relating to emotions and dealing with emotions. Like I know, like in my family, we had that stoic approach to emotions, but I learned through reading that there were all these other ways that you could deal with emotions. So I think early on, I think I really figured out maybe the stoic approach to emotions is not quite, the most ideal way of dealing with emotions. So when I went to uni, I really wanted to apply everything I learned to my own personal life and to try out different things. And I realized that when I kind of rebelled against the family norm and I spoke about my own personal feelings with other people, it just felt way healthier internally. So I really wanted to challenge myself on my assumptions and what I had been taught growing up. And I think it was really important for me when I was growing up and going through university to keep an open mind about other ways of doing things, other ways of feeling things, other assumptions about emotions, and really try and practice these emotional skills.
Yeah. I love that. It's so relatable on the whole keeping it to yourself mentality. Yeah, from a cultural perspective, I went through a similar experience.
Yeah, I would really encourage not keeping everything to yourself. I think as people, we're like social creatures and we should be able to rely on each other for social support.
Yeah, well, hitting on that social component, Maureen, I know this is probably outside of the scope of the research. You were kind of measuring the effects the decline of emotional intelligence, probably less focus on what specific aspects of digital life were causing them. But if you had to kind of speculate about it, kids are spending a ton of time on screens. If that time was spent like just playing video games or just watching Netflix shows or movies, do you think the decline would be less pronounced than it is currently, given the fact that kids are spending so much time on social media? I guess what I'm asking is, do you think there's something specifically pernicious about social media relative to other forms of consumption in the digital space?
So I can only hypothesize because I haven't exactly done an experiment comparing Netflix to video games to social media, but I actually think there is something worse about social media as compared to other forms of consumption, because with each of those things that you had just listed, you're still replacing in-person communication with either Netflix or video games or social media. But social media has the added component that it makes people have a comparative way of thinking about themselves. People tend to, and there is research on this, people when they consume social media, they tend to compare their life to the lives that other people have. And as you're probably aware of, what people put on their Facebook or their Instagram feeds is not reflective of their actual internal reality whatsoever. A person can choose what they highlight from their life to put on Facebook or Instagram. So because there is that added element of comparative thinking in social media, which probably is less present in Netflix and video games, I would hypothesize that social media is worse than Netflix or video games. But ideally, in an ideal world, people would be spending a lot more time communicating with each other face to face as compared to doing either of those things.
Mm-hmm. And that communication is also at home, like parents communicating with children and children communicating with parents, because yes, children are on screens and they get that label, but so are adults. Adults are on screens and the kids are modeling the adult. So, I mean, they learned it from somewhere. So I feel like, yeah, we can kind of like point the finger to kids being on screens and social media. But to your point around communication, it's like communicate at home. I wonder how many families are really having pure communications with each other. And, you know, if you have any information on that, I don't know if you were able to dissect the impact of a stable or unstable, or a stable family or not on the decline of emotional intelligence.
I mean, I can't specifically pinpoint it, but I have read a lot of research on communication, and it's something I actually think a lot about at work as well. That, you know, it's also the way in which we communicate with each other. Like you could have surface level conversations with your friends and your family and your co-workers, and that's not as emotionally satisfying as when you're having deeper quality conversations with each other, where you're really getting to know them. You really have an environment of psychological safety where everybody can speak their minds and talk freely with one another. So having that communication culture, I think, is so important for any kind of relationship, whether that's, you know, at work or with your friends or with your family. It's really that quality communication.
Yeah, the trend seems to be going down on the family side of things. I did a little research again in preparation for this. If you don't mind, I was going to share a couple stats on this. Okay. So according to the Institute for Family Studies in the US, divorce rates are declining. In 2020, the divorce rate was at its lowest point in 50 years. At the same time, however, US marriage rates also reached an all-time low in 2019, and the share of never married Americans is rising. So the trend seems to be that fewer Americans and subsequently their children will reap any benefits of marriage or communication, and they probably won't be able to reap the benefits of having a more stable family. So that was interesting. A couple more things I think that are really important to share around just family stability, and maybe as that declines, you'll continue to see a decline in emotional intelligence. The number of children living with two parents has dropped since 1968. While the percentage living with their mother only has doubled. So in other words, in 1968, 85% of children under 18 lived with two parents. By 2020, 70% did. About 7.6 million, or 11% of children, lived with their mother only in 1968, compared to 15.3 million, or 21% in 2020. The number of children living with their father only, although it's still small, more than quadrupled from 800,000, so about 1% of children, to 3.3 million, to about 4.5% of children, from 1968 to 2020. And in 1968, about 3% of children lived with no parent. And today, or in 2020, that's about 4% of children. So I know that's a lot of stats, but if you know me, I'm a stat guy. I think it provides context for what we're talking about, especially as it relates to the possible combination of a decrease in emotional intelligence tied to a decrease in family stability.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, the possible links between family stability and the decline of emotional intelligence. Again, this is my hypothesis, but I think if we're thinking about family stability, if I don't think it's necessarily that bad having single parent homes if in those single parent homes there is that quality communication happening with the child and both parents. I think separated couples can actually still create a really healthy environment for their kids if they're able to co-parent with each other in a very civil way and create that environment for the child where they have close bonds with both their mother and their father, or whatever gender it is. But I think what is, on the flip side of that, if you have the nuclear family, but there's a lot of instability within the parents that are together, and there's a lot of conflict within the family home, I actually think that could be more detrimental for the child than if the parents had been separated. So again, regardless of what the dynamic is in the family in terms of whether they're two-parent family homes or single parent, as long as they have that connection with their child where they communicate with a child, allow them that environment of psychological safety, allow them to express their emotions, allow them that feeling of social support, then I think that could buffer some of the negative effects.
That makes so much sense. Valid point. And you definitely provided a little more meat to that.
Thank you.
Yeah. On the topic of work, I know you've mentioned your work a couple of times, and I've been sort of thinking about emotional intelligence in the workplace. It's really interesting that as we're seeing this kind of decline in empathy, that we're seeing more conversation about empathy and compassion. And I think from like an outsider's perspective, someone that's just been dropped into this year would think this was like the year of empathy and compassion. But I think what gets left out of the conversation is really all of this has emerged because we're at like record lows of being able to tap into those emotions. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Mahreen, but what do you kind of see as the future of the conversation around empathy in the workplace?
I actually think it's really interesting. I'm glad these conversations are being had, even if they're not matching the actual reality of what's happening in the world and what's happening in society and what's happening in organizations. I'm actually glad that people are more likely to have these conversations around empathy and in the workforce. I feel like, when I think about the trends in organizational behavior and organizational psychology, a couple of decades ago, the focus was really about how do we make our employees perform better and how do we make them the most efficient machines that they can be. But this increasing recognition that employees are humans and we need to take care of their well-being and have empathy for them and what they're going through. I'm really glad that that's a conversation that's being had. I don't think organizations are doing this perfectly by any means, but I think we're getting to a place where there are organizations that have much better cultures now than anything that had happened in the past. And I think it's, a factor because we're having these conversations, but also there is a lot of research around what happens when you actually take care of employees. When employees feel like they have their organization cares about their well-being, where they're treated as humans, where they're treated with respect, it also has, and I'm kind of sorry to say it, but it also has business benefits for the organization.
Yeah.
They're more likely to be committed to the organization. They're more likely to perform better. They're less likely to take leave and sick days. So then the organization as an entity is also benefiting when they're, being empathetic and when they're taking care of employees' well-being. So it is a really fascinating space, but very, very encouraging of these conversations. But I would also be very encouraging of not just having those conversations, but actually doing something about it.
Yeah, right.
Some organizations that just talk the talk, and it's just an opportunity for like some marketing cred. But organizations that genuinely want to put in the actions to take care of their employees would be really great places to work.
Yeah.
And this conversation seems to have been going on for at least 100 years. The roots of emotional intelligence can be traced back to the concept of social intelligence, which was coined by E.L. Thorndike in 1920.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a very old concept. I mean, emotional intelligence, was really inspired by social intelligence, but only really exploded in popularity in about the 90s. So that's not that long of a time period when you think about it. But I do think it's a really growing area, and there's a lot more research on emotional intelligence that's going to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the topic of research and data, I don't want to put you on the spot talking about your work at Atlassian and People Insights, but how do you think the amount of data that employers can now collect on their employees will transform the way they're able to measure things like employee engagement and happiness and some of those softer dimensions of the employee experience? Like, is the level of granularity that we can capture with the data, will that be a good thing for connectivity between employer and employee in the coming decades, do you think, Maureen?
I think there should definitely be guidelines on how the data is going to be used, and employers really need to feel as though the data is going to be used in an ethical way. But when there are those guardrails in place, I think it is a fantastic thing for organizations to be able to collect this data, because when you're able to collect data on employee happiness and well-being and engagement, then you're able to spot the gaps and figure out, okay, who's not happy? Why aren't they happy? What can we do about it? You can't exactly put into place organizational strategies without exactly knowing what the problem is and where it is found in the organization. So the more data we can collect, the more granular we can also get in terms of what's happening in the organization and who's not happy and what can we do about it.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, I've sensed a lot of optimism on your end, which is definitely refreshing. When you think about the next few, let's say few years or 5 to 10 years, do you see a rebound in emotional intelligence? Do you think people within the younger generation are sort of starting to recognize that things aren't working? And do you think that they have the autonomy or the perspective to shift their behaviors in a way that could lead to a kind of rebound the other way? Or how do you think about the future, Maureen, as you think about emotional intelligence?
I'm actually not sure. A part of me is like, I do feel like we are going to have more conversations about emotional intelligence in the coming years. There's going to be a lot more awareness about the importance of emotional intelligence, not just to individuals, but to society. But I think there are some difficult forces at play. Like, at the end of the day, we're becoming increasingly connected through technology and social media, and I think society is also becoming very capitalistic, but it always was, but increasingly so. And this competitive kind of culture that we have is kind of antithetical to emotional intelligence, which really is about connecting with other people. So whilst I think there's going to be a lot more awareness of the problem in the coming years, I actually think it would be difficult to kind of reverse the trend. I mean, I hope we can reverse the trend, but I think it would be very hard, actually. And I think it would take a lot of conscious effort on the part of individuals to really figure out, okay, what's healthy for them. I mean, there's a lot of research on how bad junk food is for individuals, but people keep consuming junk food.
Yeah, right.
It's going to be the same kind of thing, where people become increasingly aware that social media can be very unhealthy for individuals, but it will be difficult to kind of break the bad habits.
Well, in the name of self-awareness, are you familiar with the poster that's kind of gone viral recently? It's the 50 cognitive biases of the modern world.
I'd love to see it. But
yeah, all you have to do is Google that. Google 50 cognitive biases, and it should be the first thing that comes up. But considering how many more people are interested in this subject, in empathy, in self-awareness, understanding themselves and others, it's actually a list of cognitive biases which make us all human. So I feel like that's an excellent resource to try to turn the trend, but it's going to be really hard in this digital age.
Yeah, I really think so. It'll be hard. I mean, I'm really interested to check out the 50 cognitive biases.
Yeah, Elon put that out there. He told, I don't know if it was through Twitter or whatever, but he basically said that every child should know about this. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Make a note to check it out.
Well, on the topic, I guess looking at things perhaps more pessimistically, I imagine those dimensions that you looked at around well-being and self-control and emotionality are sort of operating on relative scales, like relative to prior generations. People are scoring on those at a lower level. Is there any kind of floor to the decline that we could see in the coming years, or could it just get precipitously worse generation after generation as people retreat further and further into their digital worlds?
That's a really interesting question, and one I actually don't have the answer to. There could be a flaw, but it could also just keep going down, which I hope isn't the case, but is theoretically possible.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
If the empathy score went from like 50 to 0, can it go into negative territory?
Yeah.
Because on paper, it can go to 0, but like it could get worse technically in real life when you think about what it means. But that's very dystopian, and I hope that's not the case.
Yeah, I hope that's not the case either. Well, we do have one final question for you. We'll end on a positive note here, Mahreen. We ask one final question to all of our guests, and we'll include you in this tradition. What is one thing that you love most about yourself, Mahreen?
What a cute ending question. What do I love most about myself? That is a tough question. I love that, sometimes when life has its challenges, I think that I can handle them with a lot of resilience. And that's something that I really love about myself.
Awesome. Yeah, well, we really enjoyed having you on, Mahreen. It was a great conversation, super topical. I think a lot of people are going to get value from this. And as we talked about, it's something that people can sense in the macro, but now being able to put real meta-analysis and research around it, I think it's very useful. So thank you for the contribution to the field and for sharing space with us.
Absolutely, no worries.
And I would add that, for us, we're engaging in this type of conversation, and, now it's on us to live these things and, walk the walk. And I think if we can do that, or whoever is talking about empathy can do that and actually show the how-to part, then everyone else around them will see that. And maybe that's how we can also reverse the trend.
I would love that. That sounds awesome. Thank you both so much. I really enjoyed coming on here and chatting with you both.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mahreen. If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglaterally.com.
Thank you.